Hey there, everybody. Welcome back. Ready for another deep dive. This time we're going way back and looking at the history of weather modification.
Yeah, it's really interesting stuff.
And it's a long history, right? I mean, we found patents, actual patents, for trying to control the weather going all the way back to the 19th century.
It is, really is.
Rainmaking, clearing clouds, even some pretty out there ideas about, like, I don't know, taming hurricanes.
It's always fascinating, you know?
Like some real Wild West stuff.
It is. Humans, we've always been looking for ways to kind of exert our influence on the world.
Or make it do what we want.
Yeah, and what's more sort of universally impactful than the weather, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's the one thing that affects everybody, every day.
Absolutely. So, yeah, weather modification, it's a topic that's captured imaginations for centuries, really.
And it makes you wonder, like, what did they even think was possible back then?
You know, it's easy to look back now and maybe chuckle a little bit at some of the early attempts.
Oh, yeah.
But there was a real ambition there, you know? This belief that science could conquer, like, even the most formidable forces of nature.
Yeah.
Of course, you know, the science of meteorology back then was really in its infancy.
Right.
So some of these early inventions were, let's just say, more imaginative than practical.
More aspirational than practical.
Exactly.
Yeah. So let's get into it. Like, what did these early attempts actually look like?
Okay.
I mean, one patent that I found, this is from 1891. It's called Method of Producing Rainfall.
Wow.
So a little ambitious for the time, don't you think?
It's just a tad, yeah. That's quite the goal. But it's interesting, though, because if you consider the context, right?
Okay.
This was a time of just incredible breakthroughs in our understanding of electricity.
Right.
Tesla, Edison, like the dawn of the electrical age.
Yeah, it was magical thinking almost.
It really was. And so it's not surprising that inventors would try to harness this newfound power to influence the weather, right? I mean, lightning, after all, is just a massive electrical discharge when you think about it.
Okay, so they were trying to, create artificial lightning storms to, like, shock the clouds into raining or something?
Well, some of the patents from that era, they do involve these elaborate systems of conductors and explosives. Yeah. Hoping to influence the atmospheric conditions, it was a bit of a, throw everything at the wall and see what sticks approach.
Yeah.
But again, it speaks to that very human desire to control what we don't fully understand.
It's kind of that same drive that led to, controlled flight eventually, right?
Yeah.
A lot of crashes along the way, but they kept iterating and experimenting until they figured it out.
Exactly.
And that's kind of how innovation often works, right?
Yeah.
So with these early weather experiments, did any of them actually work?
Well, it's tough to say for sure.
Yeah.
The science of attributing cause and effect in weather patterns is incredibly complex, even today. But what we can say is that these early efforts, they really laid the groundwork for a more scientific approach to weather modification, and that's what really took off in the mid-20th century.
Okay, and that's where we get into, cloud seeding and things like that, right?
Exactly. Cloud seeding, that's a big one.
Yeah.
Emerged from a much deeper understanding of cloud physics and the role of condensation nuclei.
I remember a little bit about that from school, using, like, silver iodide or something to make it rain.
Yeah, you got it.
Am I remembering that right?
That's basically it.
Okay.
So basically, with cloud seeding, you introduce these particles into a cloud. Silver iodide's a common one because its crystal structure resembles ice.
Okay.
And these particles, they give the water molecules something to latch onto, to freeze. It's kind of like giving the clouds a little nudge to get the rain falling.
Right.
Yeah, a simplified way of putting it, but that's the gist of it.
Yeah, so we're not creating rain out of nothing. We're just kind of like, come on, let's go. Do your thing.
Yeah, exactly. We're encouraging the process.
Okay.
And this technology, it really took off in the post-World War II era.
Interesting. Why is that?
Well, there's a couple of factors at play there. One, you've got all these scientific advancements happening, but also a lot of anxieties, right?
Okay.
The Cold War was in full swing.
Right.
And the idea of, controlling the weather, that took on a whole new strategic importance.
Yeah, because if you could control the weather, you could really mess with your enemies.
Exactly. It became a whole other theater of potential conflict.
Wow, that's fascinating.
It really is. And it wasn't just about making it rain for crops anymore.
Right, right.
It was about potentially influencing weather patterns on a much, much larger scale.
So did they actually try that?
No.
Like try to weaponize the weather?
Well, there was one really famous example, Project Cirrus, that was the U.S. government's attempt to steer a hurricane using dry ice.
Wait. Hold on. They tried to, what, steer a hurricane?
Yeah.
Using dry ice.
You heard that right.
That sounds like something straight out of a science fiction movie.
It does, doesn't it?
Like, were they trying to freeze the hurricane out of existence or something?
Not quite, no. The idea was to introduce the dry ice into the hurricane to promote the formation of larger ice crystals, you see.
Okay.
And theoretically, that could disrupt the hurricane's structure and potentially weaken it.
So it's kind of like the cloud seeding idea, just on a much bigger, more dangerous scale.
In a way, yeah.
And of course, it wouldn't be a good weather modification story without some unintended consequences, right?
Right.
What happened? Did they accidentally steer the hurricane into a major city or something?
Well, thankfully, no, it wasn't quite that dramatic.
Okay.
But Project Cirrus, it did face its fair share of challenges, and the results were, well, let's just say inconclusive.
Okay.
But it did highlight the sheer complexities of trying to manipulate these weather systems and the very real potential for unforeseen consequences.
Right, because you're dealing with these massive forces of nature.
Exactly.
And we're still figuring out how they work, even today.
Exactly. And that leads us to an even more ambitious undertaking, something called Project Stormfury.
Okay, Project Stormfury. So, like, literally trying to tame hurricanes. That sounds, I don't know, almost mythical.
Yeah, it was a bold undertaking, for sure.
Like, were they trying to become the gods of weather or something?
Well, the ambition was certainly there.
I bet.
Project Stormfury, it actually spanned several decades.
Wow.
And it really was a testament to, human ingenuity and this persistent desire we have to control nature, right?
Right.
And the goal was essentially to weaken hurricanes.
Okay.
To try to lessen their destructive power. And it involved some really incredible daring maneuvers.
Okay, so paint me a picture here. Like, what did these attempts actually look like in practice?
Okay, so imagine this.
Oh.
You've got multiple aircraft, right? Flying directly into the eye of a hurricane.
Oh, wow.
One of nature's most, intense, unpredictable forces.
Yeah, you're not kidding.
And these pilots, these were incredibly skilled, brave individuals.
Yeah.
Trained to navigate, these treacherous winds, torrential rain.
Right.
All while carrying out, a very scientifically complex mission.
Yeah, talk about a tough job, right? Flying into the heart of a hurricane, that takes guts.
Absolutely.
So they're flying into the eye of the hurricane. What then? What are they actually doing up there?
So they were deploying silver iodide.
Okay.
Same material used in cloud seeding, but on a much, much grander scale.
Okay.
And the idea was to try to disrupt the hurricane's structure by seeding the eye wall.
Okay.
Which is, that most intense part of the storm, hoping to trigger changes in the storm's dynamics.
Okay, and what were they hoping to see? How do you even begin to measure success when you're talking about something as massive and powerful as a hurricane?
Well, they were looking for any decrease in wind speed.
Okay.
Any change in the hurricane's trajectory, anything that indicated that they might be able to influence its path or its intensity.
Right, even a small change would be huge.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, and there was one hurricane in particular, Hurricane Debbie in 1969, that seemed to offer a glimmer of hope.
Hurricane Debbie. Okay. What happened with that one?
So after multiple seeding flights, they actually did observe a decrease in wind speed. For a while, it seemed like, Project Stormfury might actually be onto something, that they had found a way to, if not completely control hurricanes, at least maybe lessen their impact.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting, right?
Yeah.
Because I know that ultimately Project Stormfury was deemed kind of a failure.
Yeah.
So what happened?
Well, it turned out that, attributing cause and effect in a system as complex as a hurricane, it's incredibly difficult.
Oh, I bet.
The decreases in wind speed that they observed in Debbie, while they seem to be linked to the seeding, were later observed in other hurricanes naturally.
Oh, interesting.
Hurricanes, it turns out, they go through their own cycles of intensification and weakening, regardless of, human intervention.
So it's like all that effort, all that risk, and they were basically chasing like a phantom success.
In a way, yeah.
That must have been a tough pill to swallow for the scientists involved.
It was a setback, for sure. But, not a complete loss.
Okay.
Project Stormfury, while it didn't achieve its ultimate goal, it generated this huge amount of data about hurricane behavior.
That's always helpful.
Absolutely. And that data has proven to be incredibly valuable for improving hurricane forecasting models.
Oh, okay.
And that, of course, has undoubtedly saved countless lives since then.
Right. So even when we don't, achieve our initial goals,
Yeah.
scientific exploration can often lead to, unexpected benefits down the road.
Absolutely. There's always that silver lining.
Right. There's always that silver iodide lining.
Baby.
But it seems like, by the late 20th century, the focus really shifted away from trying to control single storms, like one hurricane at a time, to tackling a much larger and more pressing issue.
Yeah.
Climate change.
Absolutely. That's when things really started to shift.
Right. So the realization that, human activities were altering the planet's climate on a global scale, that led to a whole new wave of thinking about weather modification.
Exactly.
Right. So the focus shifted from, mitigating the impact of individual storms to, how do we manage solar radiation?
Got it.
Solar radiation management. Now we're talking.
Now we're getting into the big leagues.
Yeah, we're in the realm of big ideas here. What does that even entail? Are we talking about, putting giant sunshades in space?
Well, that's one concept, actually.
Yeah?
Yeah, some of the proposed methods involve using reflective aerosols in the stratosphere to essentially reflect a small percentage of sunlight back into space.
That's right.
So effectively, dimming the sun's rays.
Okay, so instead of trying to stop a hurricane, now we're talking about, potentially controlling the planet's thermostat.
Yeah, in a way.
That's a whole new level of ambition.
It's a whole different ballgame.
It really is, and I bet that comes with a whole new level of, concern from some people.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is incredibly complex and controversial area of research.
Oh, yeah.
With, potential benefits and risks that we still don't fully understand.
Right.
But, the sheer scale of the challenge posed by climate change, that's what's led some scientists to start exploring these, seemingly outlandish ideas.
Yeah, because we're kind of running out of time to address climate change, right?
That's the harsh reality, unfortunately.
Right. And I even saw a patent that mentioned using airships for weather manipulation. Now that just sounds like something out of a Jules Verne novel.
It does, doesn't it?
But in all seriousness, where do we draw the line with this kind of technology? At what point do we say, okay, maybe this is, messing with systems that we don't fully comprehend?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is.
And there's no easy answer.
It really makes you think about, the law of unintended consequences.
Right. It really does.
We start out trying to, make it rain a little more for our crops.
Right.
And we end up contemplating, how to, control the amount of sunlight hitting the entire planet.
It really highlights that slippery slope, that we often find ourselves on when we're dealing with these emerging technologies.
Yeah.
Especially when those technologies have the potential to impact something as fundamental as the climate.
Yeah. So with these solar radiation management ideas, what are some of the risks that people have brought up? What are they worried about?
Well, I mean, for one thing, we're talking about interfering with a system as complex and interconnected as the Earth's climate, right? And we simply don't fully understand all the potential ramifications.
Oh, I'm sure.
Both immediate and long term of these kinds of interventions.
So it's not even what if it goes wrong? It's more we don't even know what right looks like.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we could end up triggering these unforeseen changes in weather patterns, ocean currents, ecosystems, you name it. Yeah. And the ripple effects could be felt, globally in ways that we can't even predict.
Yeah, because everything's connected, right?
Everything's connected.
And then there's the question of control, right?
Yes.
If we have the ability to influence, the global thermostat, who gets to decide when to turn the dial?
That's a huge one, yeah. Huge concern. And it has, geopolitical implications that I think we're only really beginning to grasp.
Oh, yeah.
Could one nation decide unilaterally to deploy these technologies, potentially impacting other countries' climates without their consent?
Right. It's a can of worms.
It's a can of worms, yeah. A lot of ethical and political questions that we need to grapple with.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about. It's really interesting stuff, though.
It is. It's fascinating.
We've gone from, rain dances to patents for dimming the sun.
I know, right.
And it feels like we're still just scratching the surface of what's possible.
I think so.
And maybe even more importantly, like, what's at stake?
Absolutely, and what our responsibility is.
Yeah.
We have this power to shape the future of our planet's climate, for better or for worse, and it's up to us to use that power wisely.
It's a lot of responsibility.
It is, but it's also an incredible opportunity, I think.
It is, yeah.
To really steer our course towards a more sustainable future.
Yeah, definitely something to ponder as we, continue to grapple with the challenges and opportunities of a changing climate. So
Yeah.
as we wrap up here, any final thoughts for our listeners out there? What should they take away from all this?
I think, the most important thing to remember is that we are at a crossroads. We really are.
Yeah.
We have this power, like we said, to shape the future.
Guide.
And it's up to us to make these informed decisions that benefit both humanity and the environment.
Well said. Well said.
Today we're thinking about weather modification.
Weather modification, yeah.
Which, talk about humans trying to bend nature to their will, right?
It's a very old idea.
It is.
Yeah.
And we're going to see just how old it is. So buckle up, listeners, because this deep dive, it's going to take us from mystical rainmakers to, believe it or not, drones dropping rain bombs.
But everything in between, yeah. It's amazing when you start looking through the history of this, how persistent this idea is, this desire to control the weather.
Yeah.
And it intersects with so many other things, Like, obviously, technology is a huge one.
Oh, absolutely.
It really makes you think, are we on the verge of, a weather-controlled world? Like something out of sci-fi?
Yeah, right. And that's what we're going to kind of get into today. And you have brought some really interesting sources for this. We've got, patent records going back over a century.
A century, yep.
A really fascinating perspective from Geoengineering Monitor, which we'll get into.
Yeah, more modern perspective.
Yeah, exactly. And then, this is so cool, a government report from 1965.
Yeah.
That kind of reads honestly, it reads like a sci-fi plot in some ways.
It really does, yeah.
Yeah.
And you can see echoes of what they were talking about then in the news today, which is fascinating.
It's a little eerie, even.
It is, a little bit, but also really interesting to see how long we've been grappling with these ideas.
Absolutely. So to kick things off, let's dive into these patents first. And, listeners, just a reminder, a patent doesn't necessarily mean something actually works.
Right.
Just that someone thought it might be worth claiming.
Exactly. It's more about tracing the evolution of thought, the sheer determination to crack the code of weather control, even if some of those early attempts, looking back, they seem a little far-fetched.
A little bit, yeah.
But, they were serious about.
We're trying, yeah.
So, okay, rewind with me. 1891, we've got a patent for a method of producing rainfall.
Method of producing rainfall.
I can't help but picture a guy in a top hat waving a magic wand trying to conjure up a downpour.
Yeah.
Right. And that whimsical image, it's not too far removed from reality. I mean, rainmaking was a common practice in the late 19th century. Yeah. And they would try all sorts of things, explosives, all sorts of, kind of superstitious rituals as well. So this patent, while it may be lacking in, what we would consider today scientific rigor, it reflects that early fascination with manipulating the skies.
Totally, yeah. Sets the scene.
Yeah, it does.
Okay, so from mystical rainmakers, we fast forward just a few years to 1905.
Okay.
And we've got means for producing high potential electrical discharges.
Oh.
This sounds a little more electrifying.
It does. And this is interesting because it marks a kind of a shift, right, towards a more technological approach to weather modification. That idea of using electricity to influence weather patterns.
Yeah.
It's something that would become a recurring theme in the decades to come.
Oh, okay. So get this. 1915, we have protecting from poisonous gas in warfare.
Okay, now this one's interesting.
Right.
Yes.
Not the rain dance I was expecting, but
No, not exactly a rain dance, but
talk about a sign of the times.
right. I mean, this patent, it offers a kind of a chilling glimpse into how weather modification could be weaponized. World War I, we saw the use of poison gas, obviously, devastating effects. And this patent suggests that some people were already thinking about, well, how can we control where this gas goes? How can we use the weather to our advantage? Maybe even,
It's a good point, right? Even back then, these scientific advancements, even if they seem on the surface to have these peaceful applications, they can have these unintended consequences, right? Or maybe sometimes they're intended consequences.
It makes you think.
It really does. Okay, 1968, get ready for this title.
Okay.
Pyrotechnics, comprising silver iodate, ammonium nitrate, nitrocellulose, and nitrate esters.
That's a mouthful.
I know. I mean, just
What is going on there?
I don't even know what all of those are, but they don't sound like they go together necessarily.
No, they don't sound very friendly, do they?
No, not really. But it does make you think, like, how the research into weather modification, it just got more complex, right? Like, it seems like they were willing to, like, literally play with fire.
Yeah. And you could see that progression, right, from those early rainmakers to something like this, where it's like, okay, we're getting more sophisticated in our understanding of chemistry, of physics, and, that's both exciting and a little bit
Unnerving.
Yeah, a little bit unnerving.
Yeah. All right, fast forward to 2001. We've got a patent for a hurricane and tornado control device.
Hurricane and tornado control device.
Talk about ambition, right?
That is ambitious. Trying to control some of the most powerful forces of nature. I mean, were they really trying to play God?
Yeah.
I don't know, but it's fascinating. Even if it's, maybe far from practical application, it just shows that allure of controlling the weather, it persists.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I saved, I think, the most intriguing one for last. 2023, so fresh off the press, basically. Device for unmanned aerial vehicle to deploy a rainfall catalytic bomb. Drones dropping rain bombs.
Okay, there we go.
Like, is this actually happening?
I mean, this is where it starts to get really interesting and potentially, a little concerning for some people, because the technology for drone deployment, it's advanced so rapidly, right? And now you have people thinking, well, we can use this for all sorts of things, including potentially weather modification. It's definitely something to keep an eye on. Let's just say that.
It's a lot to think about. Drones dropping rain bombs? I mean, it sounds like something out of a movie.
It does make you wonder where the line is between science fiction and reality these days.
Right. Like, how far are we really from this?
Right. And that's actually a perfect segue to kind of what we wanted to talk about next, which is more contemporary perspective on all of this.
Exactly, because this isn't just some wacky historical side note, right? Like this whole idea of, controlling the weather, it's still a thing.
Oh, it's very much a thing. Yeah, it's called geoengineering.
Geoengineering, right. And you brought up Geoengineering Monitor earlier. Yeah. So let's bring them into the conversation, right? Because they have a really interesting take on all of this.
Yeah, they do. They provide a good, I think, kind of a grounding in what we're actually talking about when we say geoengineering.
Yeah, so give us the 21st century lowdown. Like, what is geoengineering?
So they define it as basically large-scale interventions in, well, everything, really, our oceans, soils, and the atmosphere.
Okay.
And the goal, they say, is to address the symptoms of climate change.
Symptoms. Okay, so not necessarily fixing the problem, but more like putting a Band-Aid on it.
That's one way to look at it, yeah. And it's interesting, right, because we've been talking about all these patents, these ideas for controlling hurricanes, making rain, all these things.
Right.
And it makes you wonder, like, are the motivations always as simple as just, fixing the weather? Or is there something else going on there?
Right, because, I mean, we saw those patents that were talking about, like, weaponizing the weather, right?
Exactly. And it's not to say that everyone involved in geoengineering has, nefarious intentions. But,
right.
But it's something to be aware of.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So we're talking about potentially like a future where instead of actually addressing climate change, we're just kind of masking the symptoms.
It's a possibility, yeah. And it's something that, we need to think about carefully because the technology is getting more and more sophisticated. But are we really thinking through the consequences of using it,
Right. And speaking of consequences, let's talk about that 1965 report because this is where it gets, I think, really interesting.
This is a fascinating document.
Yeah. So 1965, I mean, the world was a very different place. Like what were people worried about back then?
Well, one of the things that they highlight in this report is just the sheer scale of energy that you would need to actually control weather systems.
Okay.
Like even back then, they understood that we're talking about forces of nature that are just mind-bogglingly powerful, like way beyond anything humans have ever been able to create.
So all those patents we were talking about, all those ideas for controlling hurricanes, making it rain, all that, maybe it hasn't quite panned out because honestly, the science is just that much harder than we thought.
It's entirely possible, yeah.
Mm.
Like, we like to think we can control everything, but nature has a way of, you know.
Reminding us who's boss.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing that this report talks about is how interconnected everything is.
Right.
Like, they even use the term rain shadow.
Rain shadow, yeah.
Basically, the idea that if you force rainfall in one area, you're going to inadvertently cause a drought somewhere else.
Right, because you're messing with these huge systems, right?
Exactly. And it's not just about rainfall. It's about ecosystems. Right. It's about potentially even political conflict, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Like, if one country starts messing with the weather, what are other countries going to do?
Yeah, it's a whole thing. And they were already thinking about this back in 1965.
They were. Like, they dedicated a whole section of this report to talking about the potential consequences of weather modification.
Wow. So they're grappling with these really complex ethical questions, right? Long before, climate change was like the huge issue that it is today.
Exactly. Yeah. And you know what else is really interesting about this report?
What's that?
They actually recommend very strongly that we invest in social science research.
It's interesting.
Alongside the physical science of weather modification.
Okay. So, like, not just figuring out how to do it, but also figuring out what happens if we do it?
Exactly. They understood, even back then, that this wasn't just a technological challenge. It was a societal one.
Wow. So they were calling for, like, ethics committees alongside their labs, essentially?
Pretty much. They realized that just because we can do something doesn't necessarily mean we should.
It's almost like they knew we'd be having this conversation, 50 years later.
It really is remarkable how prescient they were. And it speaks to something I think really important, which is that, with all of our focus on technology, on innovation, sometimes we forget about the human element.
Right. And that's really what it comes down to, right? I mean, we've gone on this whole journey from, rain dances to drones dropping rain bombs.
And everything in between.
Yeah. And it seems like these ethical questions, they keep getting bigger, right? Like, the stakes are just higher.
The stakes are higher because the planet is changing, right? Climate change is real.
Right.
It's happening. And so people are, understandably, looking for solutions.
Right.
And geoengineering, it can seem like a really appealing solution.
Right, like a quick fix.
So it's like, we can just, tweak a few things and everything will be fine. But as we've seen, throughout history, and as this 1965 report points out so clearly, it's not that simple.
Because it's like, even if we can figure out how to do all of these things, like even if we can get these drones to drop these rain bombs and it works exactly how we want it to, like, what are the unintended consequences of that?
Right, exactly. Like, that's the question, right? What happens if we get it wrong? Yeah. And even if we get it right, who gets to decide what right even means? Yeah.
Right. Because it's such a complex system, right? The weather, like, it's not just about rain or sunshine. It's connected to everything.
Everything, ecosystems, agriculture, where people live, how they live. It's all interconnected. And so to think that we can just, like, manipulate one part of that without affecting everything else, it's naive at best.
Yeah, it is. It's almost like that butterfly effect, right? But, like, on a global scale.
Exactly. And that's why I think this 1965 report is so important, because it's like a reminder, like, hey, we were thinking about this 50 years ago and we still haven't figured it out.
And it's not just about figuring out the technology, right? Like, that's the point they were making, is that it's also about these bigger questions.
The social, the ethical, the political questions. Oh. Because technology without, kind of a moral framework, it's dangerous.
It is. It really is. And that's something I think that we all need to be thinking about, right? Like, as citizens, as humans living on this planet.
Yeah, because it's the only one we've got.
It is. So to kind of, like, bring this all home for our listeners, think about this. Imagine a world where we can perfectly control the weather.
Okay.
Right? No more droughts, no more hurricanes, sunny skies for every picnic. Sounds pretty good, right?
On the surface, yeah.
Right. But, like, should we? Like, is that something we should even be striving for? And if we do, what are the unintended consequences? Because there will be some.
There always are.
Yeah. So, something to think about. This has been the Deep Dive. We're going to leave you with more questions than answers today. But hopefully, something to ponder. Until next time.